Lovely ball down the line towards Klukas. Can he keep it in play? He can. Over towards the back post, and it's in! It's probably a half that hasn't warranted a goal, but Hull City have got one. Alex Bruce waiting at the back post, and his header floated over the top of the goalkeeper. Great cross from Klukas. It was a lovely ball as well from Robertson. Klukas just kept the ball in play, delivered the cross in with precision and power, and the Tigers are in front.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the 2010s Flashback Series. Back for another episode in the off season as we wait for football to recommence. I'm your host Alex, and with me I have Dan. How are you, Dan?
Yeah, look, I'm pretty good. It has been a little bit quiet without the early starts and football to watch, but I suppose we've got the Women's World Cup starting shortly over here, so that'll be good to watch some football live again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did find it sort of appropriate, I suppose, that we're up to the 2015-16 season in our reviews, looking back at the last time we were promoted from the championship. So hopefully boding well for the coming season. We've just had our first signing announced a couple of days ago as well. So everything's starting to kick off again. I actually realized that today marks 1 month to go until the season starts again. So it does feel like it's come around pretty quickly all of a sudden. But look, we'll jump right into it. Looking back on the first half of that 2015-16 season. So under Steve Bruce, we'd been relegated from the Premier League, a whole bunch of injuries, probably to blame in a large part for the performances. But I guess casting your mind back, first of all, looking back at heading into that season, what was your, and I suppose, and I'm sure we've talked about this before, I feel like there's a lot of parallels between this season and perhaps the League One season that we've just experienced, where you probably headed into this season not really knowing what to expect, what sort of table position to be hoping for, but probably optimistic that the squad was strong enough to bounce back.
Yeah, look, I think it was fairly disappointing, sort of the way that we slipped away from Premier League football down into the Championship. But I guess, I think we still did. I know there was lots of incomings and outgoings, but I think the squad we went down with was a very strong squad, and I think despite the expectation that there would have been some player movement, I think I was reasonably confident that we would be up and around top six, and I think certainly the first part of that season there was some very, very strong early promise. It looked at one point like we were just going to run away with the league, but yeah, I think I was optimistic that we would go well, and then just. I think the extent, the amount of transfer movement is probably what was a little surprising.
Yeah, we'll touch on the transfer news, because we were sort of looking at it just before we went to air, and there was a lot of movement. I found, I guess for me, and yeah, I guess again, sort of paralleling that League One season, you saw the shift in sponsorship. For example, we went from having 12Bet as the sponsor to having Flamingo Land, which in some corners got a bit of mockery, I suppose, because of the name of it. But when you consider it's a local sponsor and all of that, I think there's a lot of positive response to it, I suppose. It's sort of similar to having Geocom when we went down to League One.
Actually, this is the first, I just realized this is the first jersey I bought was the Flamingo Land.
There you go.
Hernandez number 9.
Well, because I was going to say, because normally I try and wear a shirt that I have from that particular season, and this was actually the first season I didn't have a shirt from. I don't actually know. I think it probably just got to a point of the season where I went, we're going to go up anyway, so I'll wait till we get back up into the Premier League to get a shirt. But look, there you go. But I guess the other thing with the off-season news was, I think this was this off-season anyway, was when the Allams had challenged the name change result because they were trying to argue some technicality about someone being biased or whatever it was. And I think the outcome was finally confirmed in the off-season going into this season. And so to some extent there was, the fact that was now buried and done with. But at the same time not buried with some people, because it's just something that the Allams didn't seem to want to move on from, as unfortunately we saw with the League One, the Championship trophy being engraved with Hull Tigers on it and things like that, all very spiteful. And this was, and you know, sort of jumping ahead to the end of the season with Bruce leaving, but this was sort of the last season of that era that we had with Steve Bruce and that squad and sort of the unity to some extent, at least, in the club.
Yeah, that the vendetta that the Allams developed with the EFL, or towards the EFL, was very strange. And yeah, I think it played out in a lot of negative ways for a few years, really. You know, realistically, I mean, yes, we went back up this season, but I think really starting at the end of the previous year, what's a little bit 14-15 season, that really, like, all of that name change stuff that just hung over the heads of, or was held over the heads of the club, really, by the Allams, almost right up until they finally moved it on. So yeah, that was a bit of a, yeah, definitely a thing. Yeah, look, I always really liked Steve Bruce. I thought he seemed to have a good, like, I mean, he had a very successful stint with us, seemed to be able to get the best out of the players and build a really good, tight-knit group, which he hasn't really been able to. I haven't seen him manage to do that at, you know, some of the other clubs he's been to after us anyway, particularly. But yeah, it was an odd it's an odd feeling when, yeah, your owners want to, you know, essentially, like, fight with the governing body that you're trying to, like, play football within. It's like bite the hand that feeds you, almost. Like, it's
Yeah. So it was a very strange sort of season in that respect. And if we touch on, first of all, I guess we'll talk about the incomings before we touch on the departures as well, who sort of essentially funded these signings. It's sort of a mixed bag when you look at the three faces on the screen. We've got Odebajo, Maloney, and Clucas as probably the three, I suppose you would say, highest profile signings. Of course, the one that I'd actually completely forgotten was signed in the summer as well was Diamande, because he was out injured until late December. I actually always associated him as being a January signing, which I suppose in a similar way, in years to come, we'll probably look back on Adama Traore in the same way. But, you know, I look at Odebajo as probably arguably the most talented player that we signed that summer. I would say the most talented player we signed that summer, who just, unfortunately, to the end of the season, or even I guess it was the preseason for the following season, copping that, was it a dislocated knee or something in training, which it seems like we've run over a black cat or something in our lives as a football club, because of the number of fluky, sort of unfortunate injuries that we've copped to players right up until in recent times as well with Emmanuel. Maloney, a good servant for a couple of seasons. He seemed to, you know, stay quite relevant and capable in that Premier League season the following year. And of course, Clucas was probably the most successful in terms of obviously the profit we were able to make on him and the impact that he had over these two seasons as well. But a couple of pretty shrewd signings.
Yeah, Odebajo, supremely talented, did really, really well, and then kind of just has kind of just faded off, unfortunately, into obscurity. Yeah, I'm sure in those.
I wouldn't even know where he is now,
thanks to that injury. Yeah, but he was certainly, when we signed and we saw him starting to play some football, we thought this is a long term. This is a guy who's for the future, who's, you know, at the appropriate level now. Can't wait to see him next year in the Prem. All those things, and it just never really worked out.
And the other big shame with him as well was that we wanted to get Andre Gray as almost a package deal from Brentford at the time, and that was almost one of the first few inklings of issues with between the ownership and Steve Bruce, where Bruce was very keen to make the double signing, and Ehab sort of kept haggling over the fee, and Gray ended up going to Burnley and being a huge success there. It was a massive shame.
Yeah. Sean Maloney was, I think, one that sort of caught me off. Like, he sort of came out of a little bit out of nowhere, not one that I was maybe expecting. Because did he end up coming from Chicago, or did he go to Chicago?
Yeah. Came from the MLS, yeah.
That's right. But like, had been playing in Scotland for ages, but then went overseas, and so it was like, oh, we've got someone back from MLS, which is a bit, a little bit strange. But yeah, I think he, played his part. And apparently, very good football brain, because I think he went into he was like assistant for Belgium or something like crazy.
Yeah, and he's the Wigan manager now.
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah.
Even closer to home than I was thinking. Sam Clucas, I think this was about the time when Vardy and Leicester were going great guns, and there was all the things about, oh, look at what Vardy's done moving up the leagues and rah, and we sort of were doing a similar going, Clucas played here, and then he went here, and then he's gone here, and then I think next season he's in the Prem, and he just seemed to be a player who was just capable of just finding another level whenever it was required. So he was certainly a favourite of mine while I was at the club, and just when he came to us, but certainly a young guy who just gave everything. I think was played out of position, started as playing as a winger, I think, for a while, and then for however it came about, maybe it was, I can't remember, through injuries or something, I assume, shifted, played in the centre of the park, and then all of a sudden went, geez, what a player this guy is in here. So that was the beginning.
As a very different sort of player, but he is very similar to Regan Slater in that sense, I think, where he kind of comes in and proves his value, or proves his worth by being able to play in a number of different positions. I still can't think what his best position really is. I feel like maybe it's on a left wing or something like that, but also, as you say, I mean, he was playing well in central midfield as well. I don't quite know, because he's just been released by Stoke. I don't actually know if he's now got a club, but he's one that's had a bit of a strange career since leaving us.
Yeah, I think he came from Chesterfield or something for a few $100,000 or something, like nominal, not a huge fee. And then what did we end up selling him for?
Oh, it was like 13 or something. Yeah, it was quite a lot.
Yeah,
it was crazy.
But yeah, I think on top of those, a couple of interesting loan signings as well that year that worked out, and some that have obviously gone on to bigger and brighter things.
Yeah, Chuba Akpom, of course, and on the previous image, I'll flick back to it. So we've got Chuba Akpom, who joined on loan from Arsenal. Isaac Hayden as well from Arsenal, who I actually forgot we sent back in January because it didn't quite work out for him. Obviously, he's had a pretty decent spell at Newcastle as well. I mean, I guess those are probably the two main ones. Ryan Taylor, of course, joining from Newcastle as well, who chipped in a little bit as well, all contributing. But if we're talking about player sales as well, if we flick to the next one, we've got a couple of players who were pretty integral in that first, I suppose, kind of core of City players that we kind of grew up knowing and associating with the club in those promotion seasons, with Robbie Brady and James Chester being the first of that sort of group to leave for quite significant fees. I think it was Brady went to Norwich for, I've got the fee here, £7 million, and Chester going to West Brom for $8 million. And I remember at the time Chester being really sort of emotional about actually leaving the club, and it was one of those ones where, and we were talking before we went to air about the fact we were able to retain so much of the squad, and most likely that being because of these fees we got for players. But you can't help but feel when it's players almost being forced out the door against their will that it's such a shame for them to leave, because they'd become such key parts of the team. Yeah,
and it was only a few years after that we were crying out for an experienced centre back, and what we would have loved to have had someone like James Chester there at that a couple of years after this.
Yeah, no doubt. Probably at the other end of the scale, unfortunately, because I did quite enjoy watching him play in a City shirt. But Jelavic was one that, you always get a couple of these sorts of players when you drop to the Championship who just kind of go, yeah, I'm not too keen to play in this division, and they sort of look for any route out. And I think I remember he played the first couple of games, and I think he might have scored against Wolves, or he got in a fight with Akpom about taking the penalty against Wolves. There was something happening in that Wolves game, and then he was off to West Ham. And Jai went to Trabzonspor as well, before I think he came back to the Premier League with Sunderland. So got a couple of decent fees for these players, and you sort of think, and we were talking before. I mean, I'd actually completely forgotten that Tom Ince going to Derby as well for about £5 million, and you think these days, and in a way, I suppose it's a good reflection on the way that FFP is working. That you don't have these championship clubs just throwing around such crazy fees, but you think £5 million for a club that hadn't been anywhere near the Premier League for a fair while, it was absolutely wild money for Derby to be spending.
Yeah, I think it is. I think as you sort of touched on with the FFP, that it is seems to be slowly working the way it's intended to, which is to try and keep clubs buying within their means. So we have less clubs, going into administration and all sorts of bankruptcy and all sorts of wild things. So I think that on that side it's good, but yeah, it's very interesting to see. I haven't actually reflected enough or looked back and thought about the change in fees, but to go Tom Ince, who had done not really a lot with us, to sell for $5 million is a bit crazy. So yeah, it's interesting.
And of course, there's players who haven't even got on here that were also pretty key parts of the squad. In guys like, you're looking at Mena Figueroa going to Colorado. You got Paul McShane going to Reading, Stephen Quinn also going to Reading, and of course our at the time future manager, current manager now, Liam Rosenior going to Brighton. So quite a turnover, I suppose, in that sense of that kind of core players, as we're touching on before, of the players that got us promoted in the first place. And I suppose then you're sort of forgiven heading into that season where you think, geez, that sort of turnover and with those sorts of presences in the squad leaving, it can have quite a significant impact on the morale and camaraderie in the squad. But perhaps it sort of shows, as you were saying before, that it's a sort of testament to Steve Bruce's managerial ability that he was showing with City, that he could basically say, this is the squad I want, this is how I can shape it, and I'll, get us in the promotion picture.
Yeah, I think obviously, I guess it's a weird thing with the managerial position. Like, if the longer you are at a club, obviously the more and you're successful, the more likely you are to be able to sort of have some say, be listened to, be heard. But the flip side of that is that when you're successful in any way, then most clubs, once you have some measure of failure, you get relegated, whatever, then a lot of the time, particularly I guess maybe more so in the last 5 years than then, but that's that sort of reaction to make changes and not try and stick the course through the hard times, because it doesn't really seem like these days, and maybe I'm just thinking of the last couple of years with City, but it doesn't seem like there's too many managers that are sticking at a club for an extended period of time, where I suppose, you've got, Guardiola at City and Klopp at Liverpool has been there a while now, but, particularly at, a smaller club like ours that doesn't have necessarily the resources to really actually just to ride out that and build a huge institutional change or a huge system, that it is testament to, I think, Bruce's his management and his ability that he was able to work his magic through, I guess, so many ups and downs.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, if we take that, if we take that moment, actually speaking of Bruce, so we had the audio at the start of the episode of Alex Bruce getting his one and only goal for the club against Ipswich, which came in that first half of the season. But if we talk about the impact that Bruce had on that season, and you almost had it was almost a perfect encapsulation of the good and the bad of Steve Bruce, I suppose. And I mean, we say that, and then you look at again that League One season under Grant McCann, and we had the same issue right around Christmas where you drop a couple of games and it can change the whole complexion of the season. And McCann was able to get things back on track, and we finished top of the table. But you look at that season and you reflect on the fact that we lost 6 games in the first half of that season, 4 of them coming between the 27th of November and 28th of December. Those 4 games that we lost, we only lost 5 more games for the entire season. And you think up until that point, we had that patch between basically the 20th of October and 7th of November where we scored 12 goals, conceded 0, and we're sitting top of the table. You sort of think those 4 losses really sort of undid the season. And you look at the teams that we were losing to there, and in fairness, Derby County finished 5th right behind us in the table, so a loss to them isn't too galling. But the losses to Rotherham and probably to Preston as well, both teams that finished lower half of the table, you sort of think that was sort of I guess my overriding memory of that season, when you think of the guys we had in that team like Diami, Huddleston, Hernandez, Dawson, even sort of guys that when it came to the midweek games and backing up and playing 3 games in a week, it did seem as if whilst we had our team, Bruce had a really strong reliance on a sort of a core set of players. When it came to those midweek games, we did sort of seem to struggle to back up. And especially over those winter months, it did seem as if with the games coming thick and fast, we just couldn't kind of keep it going.
Yeah, I think certainly one of the highlights for me from this was seeing Hernandez come back to fitness and I think really show his capabilities as a number 9, because he just was banging them in left, right, and center through this season. But yeah, I think certainly, I think we seem to have this proclivity to fold to shit teams in the league anyway. But it was particularly damaging this time when we were started so brightly and we're going so well, and then to have that purple patch through October and early November, and then sort of just finish that purple patch and then just go straight into essentially a form slump was a bit confounding, difficult to understand. But yeah, I think certainly with the quality of players that we had, I think we should never have been able to put ourselves in that sort of position anyway. I think we should have been able to find ways to win some of those games, but it is what it is. I think this was a season where we got to this point and we started talking about whether we had too many irons in the fire, whether it was worth trying to push through, because I think we got to the 5th round of a few of the cups, so not heaps, but got through a couple of rounds of games, and you're going, is it worth forcing all these extra midweek games? But I don't know. Here's what it is, I guess. And that made it work in the end.
Yeah, I mean, look, it was a good shout. I'd forgotten to mention we did make the 5th round of the League Cup that season, beating Accrington, Stanley, Rochdale, and Swansea and Leicester. So you think I think I remember making a big deal out of that win over Leicester that season. I think we beat them on penalties, but they were on their way to the Premier League title, and as one of the only teams to knock them off that season was a bit of fun. And we lost 4-1 to Man City eventually in that competition. But it is funny, actually, you mentioned, talking about having focus on too many competitions and our sort of discussions around it, because of course the fun thing about this season was it was the first season that the podcast was running, which makes it feel like the podcast has been going for bloody ages, which it absolutely has. But it will be interesting as we get into the next few seasons, and the podcast, I guess, gets a bit more prolific to reflect on. We've got an entire season of the podcast reflecting on the same season we're kind of summarizing here, but it's a little bit of fun. But yeah, look, it was a tricky one. Like, ultimately we were promoted, so it's hard to be too critical of that season, and obviously we got the great memories of the playoffs out of it. But I sort of look back on that run of games in October, November, where we were just battering teams. And you look at some of the names of the teams, with the wins against Brentford and Middlesbrough, who of course went on to finish second, and Burnley in December winning 3-0 against them as well. So you think we handled the teams around us in the table so comfortably for the majority of the season, to not then be able to finish in the top two was just a little bit frustrating.
Yeah, I think realistically that was probably one of the biggest the frustrations come towards the end of the season. It was going, how do we not finish top two? But as you say, the end result was we got some great games in those playoffs. Very tense, but the memorable games.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, we'll do a second half of this season review, perhaps in the next week or two, as we edge into preparation for the new season. We'll talk a bit more about those playoff games and the excitement and the joy that came with those. But until then, was there any final thoughts on this half of the season, or I think we've just about covered it all?
No, I think that's sort of it. I think this was I just remember just really enjoying, particularly Hernandez going at it. I think Diame was a joy to watch a lot of the time. Yeah, I think it's weird. It's weird thinking about this being so long ago and then going, this was the last year of Bruce as well, and going,
yeah,
geez, and just then my head starts thinking about all the bloody managers that have gone since then, and you had to have one guy for 4 or 5 years or something, and then was it quite that long? And then just the massive extent, just the numbers that have come through the door since.
And actually, I think, and talking about Diame and those guys, the last thing I'd say is I feel like maybe it's the second half of the season when Snodgrass made his return from injury as well, because I know he scored the winner against Wolves, which was definitely second half of the season. That was in April. So I feel like he must have returned just around then. But that'll be something else to touch on in the second half, because he obviously played a big part that season and the following season as well. But look, thank you for joining me for this one, Dan.
That's all right.
And thank you everyone for listening in. We'll be back sometime soon to recap the second half of this season. And then, of course, as we announced in the last couple of weeks, we'll also be doing our season preview with the two Hull and Back boys right here on this channel the week or so before. I think it might be the 2 weeks before the season kicks off. I should know that. It's the 29th of July anyway. I think that's the week before. So we've got that to look forward to as well. But until next time, catch you next time.